Well, at Property Tribes, we're on a mission to help you live your best landlord life. And part of the way we do that is to bring you interviews with industry commentators and also people involved in the industry. And I'm delighted to be joined today by John Eastgate, who's Sales and Marketing Director of OneSavings Bank, which is the overarching brand of Kent Reliance and Interbay buy-to-let products. John, great to have you joining us here on Property Tribes TV. I thought it'd be really interesting to talk to you because Kent Reliance recently released the buy-to-let written report and came up with some very interesting observations about the future of buy-to-let, and it was surprisingly optimistic.
Yes, I think there's an element of turning a corner to it, I suppose, in as much as buy-to-let's obviously had a few travails of late through regulation and political intervention, and that's driven some changes in arguably in the way the market operates. And I think what we saw with this report was potentially a flattening out and a slight upturn in the level of landlord confidence. And I think there's a lot of factors that have driven that, but the fact that we seem to have bottomed out from all the headwinds that seem to have hit the market in the last few years and shown that first sign of potentially an upturn is something that's quite encouraging.
I got the impression from the report that landlords perhaps thinking of an investment horizon of maybe 10 years should actually think longer term than that and push back even further and be prepared to stay in the sector for a longer time.
Yeah, and I think that's fair, and I think also it reflects the view that the market is professionalising, and so people enter into profession typically for the long term.
True, yeah.
And so it's the last thing that the buy-to-let market should be looked at is an easy way to turn some quick money. There's a lot of commitment, there's a lot of effort, and it takes a long time to make those returns. So as with any business, the startup costs are usually something that has to be clawed back over the first few years. So anybody looking at it as short-term investment is probably looking at it. Is probably looking in the wrong place in terms of getting a quick return. Being a landlord, we firmly believe, is about a commitment to the long-term commitment to your tenants, commitment to looking after your property, and that's why we have habitually targeted professional landlords as opposed to the more opportunistic or accidental landlords. And there are plenty of lenders out there who will do that and will do so very well, but that's never been an audience that we've particularly sought.
You mentioned that the government is trying to professionalise the sector, and I definitely believe that's the way it's going. So do you think that we're seeing the death of the so-called amateur or dinner party landlord?
It's difficult to kind of be too extreme about the death of the sector or I think there's definitely a trend toward the professionalisation of the sector. I don't know necessarily that's something the government sought by design. I think the government's activities in relation to the buy-to-let sector have been driven largely by political favour, to be brutally honest. However, I do think that the law of unintended consequences is applied quite favourably on this occasion, because actually if we deliver a market in which we have more qualified, more committed landlords who are more able to manage their properties, better equipped to understand the dynamics of and what it means to be a landlord, and if that then produces better quality accommodation for tenants to live in, then I think that's a general good for tenants, for landlords, for society, at the risk of sounding too grand, but this is a very important societal issue, and actually, if it takes also, on the other hand, if it takes people out of the market who were only otherwise going to go into it because they thought there's a few quid to be made here, then equally that's a good thing, because nobody wants to see people putting money into investments that they don't fully understand.
Indeed. What were some of the other highlights from the report? Because one thing I noticed was that the report was very optimistic about the London property market in the long term, which is good news for me because I've got some apartments and flats in London. So obviously over a very long time period, it can only be speculative. We don't know how the market's going to perform, but your report was quite positive about London.
So I'm a firm believer in the adage of form is temporary, class is forever. So London has always been the market that feels the pain the most when things aren't going so well, and typically gains the most when it is going so well. But if you look at it in the long run, then the emphasis can't be too strong on the long run. London does very well, always has done, and as we become a more urban society, and workers and commuters are increasingly based in large cities, then the long run for London always looks good. What I would say, and we echo this in the way in which we lend our money in our lending policies, is I would take great care around new developments, around chrome and glass, for example. We and many other lenders indeed have always been a little bit suspicious around chrome and glass. There's too much of it, goes up too quickly, and becomes effectively a buy-to-let ghetto in many ways, with an oversupply of rental properties. We're much more attracted to classical properties, maybe converted houses, more run-of-the-mill kind of accommodation, rather than something that's been purpose-built as a new build flat, for example.
I'm so glad you said that, because I've written an article that I think houses are actually becoming an endangered species, and particularly with the advent of build to rent, which we know are going to be these glass and chrome blocks that are going to be apartment living for probably young professionals and couples. They're not going to appeal at all to families that want a family home in a good school catchment area.
Absolutely not.
So I can see moving forwards, and I have said this on Property Tribes, that houses are going to be an endangered species, and where there's scarcity, there's even more value.
And I think the other thing is that families are often overlooked as tenants. I mean, people make assumptions about it being young professionals and so on and so forth, or students or whatever, but actually families are tenants, and increasingly so families are tenants, because getting on the housing ladder and getting a mortgage and all the rest of it and buying your own house isn't getting any easier. So with families forming such a large proportion of the tenant community, it's important to provide a product that meets their needs.
Yeah, and there was a recent report out actually that said that families are the least hassle of any tenant demographic as well. So that's another good reason to provide properties for them. Clearly we're hearing about landlords looking at different ways to mitigate the impact of Section 24. Do you have a view on going the limited company incorporated route?
There are some very clear benefits to going down the limited company route, in terms of the tax charges. I'm not a tax qualified individual. We would always encourage somebody to seek appropriate tax advice. And your mortgage broker, however well qualified he or she may think they are not either. So you shouldn't take advice from your mortgage broker. You should go to somebody suitable. There are benefits to it, and there are circumstances where it probably isn't worthwhile. What we have seen definitely is a shift towards new purchases being made through limited company vehicles. That's undoubtedly a clear trend. We've also, which I think is probably a little bit more interesting, is we're starting to see the first few large portfolio landlords who've gone through the process of taking tax advice, starting to switch their portfolios from being in their individual names into limited companies. So that's, there's obviously a lot of complicated tax issues around that, around CGT and stamp duty. But it's interesting that they're starting to switch their legacy portfolios into limited companies. Complicated transactions, but we're starting to see that come through.
Do you think there's any particular strategy that works really well in the current market conditions?
I think this. If I was a landlord, and I can speak without conflict because I'm not. I think I would run my business like I would run any business or operate any business, which is I'd look after my customers and I'd make sure that they were happy. So this isn't my quote, but I like it, so I use it. I think landlords who look at their customers. Look at their tenants as customers, and look at the money they have to spend on their property as an investment in their property. That's the mindset that I think a landlord should have. And any landlord who's looking to cut costs to a minimum and sees a tenant just as somebody who happens to be paying the rent for the period of time they happen to be in the property is probably always going to come up, or continuously come up against issues, hurdles, things that just inconvenience them. So make that little bit of extra investment up front. and I'm sure you'll get a longer payoff in the long run.
I'm so glad you said that, because I agree 100%. And I always say, when you've let a property, it's not a case of just sitting back and watching the rent roll in. When you let the property, that's actually the start of the process. It's not the end of the process, because obviously landlords have over 160 government statutes and regulations to adhere to. And you've as you say, you've got to fully understand your business and operate like a business. And I think as we wind this up, your report very much said that, or suggested that, it would be the professional and educated landlord who treated it as a business who could enjoy success of buy-to-let in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And notwithstanding all that's happened in the buy-to-let market, the buy-to-let investor who follows that strategy can still make a very decent return.